Venezuela's opposition out of the running as the president plans to block his political rivals from taking part in the next election. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Nicolas Maduro's opposition crackdown. His party stormed to victory at local elections this weekend. Nicolas Maduro then immediately set his sights on next year's presidential race by announcing a ban on the opposition. The socialist leader said any party that boycotted the latest vote would disappear from the political map. That means 3 of his 4 biggest opponents could be out of contention. It's just the latest chapter in Venezuela's political saga, where Maduro has overseen an economy in free fall, violent protests, and a shortage of food and medicine. For his critics, this latest move is evidence he's a dictator, yet his supporters continue to hold him up as a hero. So which is it? Vanessa Keneally reports.
Casting his vote in a local election that's attracting global attention. Attention that President Nicolas Maduro used to highlight Venezuela's democratic system.
Today, I'm sure, as night comes, we will have verified results, certified, reliable, and audited results of the 335 municipalities of the country.
And those results were indeed ready within hours and quickly celebrated by Maduro and his supporters.
We have won more than 300 mayoral offices in the country of the total 335.
But the 3 main opposition parties chose to boycott the vote, calling it deeply flawed and Maduro corrupt. By Monday, he said they'd be banned from taking part in next year's presidential election for failing to take part in this one, compounding an already deeply divided country. Next year's presidential election is set to take place in December, but it could be sooner if political instability worsens. Opposition parties Justice First, Popular Will and Democratic Action all say this week's mayoral election was rigged in favour of Maduro's United Socialist Party of Venezuela, with reports of food vouchers allegedly being traded for votes. They also say there were irregularities in a previous election in October, which included a shortage of polling stations in anti-Maduro neighbourhoods. Maduro has been in power since 2013, when his predecessor Hugo Chavez died. His Socialist Party has led Venezuela for 18 years, but it's facing instability and economic challenges. This year alone has seen more than 100 people die in protests against the government, several opposition members imprisoned, and the nation suffering one of the biggest economic meltdowns in Latin American history. Maduro has also made international enemies and has blamed the US for destabilizing his country with sanctions. Maduro insists his decision to ban the opposition from Sunday's election was because he was following criteria set by the National Constituent Assembly, an assembly which came into force in August and has the ability to rewrite the constitution, as well as being dominated by people loyal to Maduro.
Una farsa electoral.
It was an electoral farce that does not reflect in any way the will for change of a people that today wants things to be different in our country.
So with another election next year, will opposition parties be able to think outside the box to oust a man they've labelled a dictator, but to others is a hero? Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Latin America analyst Javier Farge. In Washington, D.C., we have Sonia Schott. She's the managing director of the Schott International Consulting, which looks at U.S.-Venezuela relations. And in San Francisco, Marco Aponte Moreno. He's a senior teaching fellow at University College London who specializes in Venezuelan politics. Thanks all of you for joining us. Javier, let me begin with you. Maduro announcing a party that has not participated today, cannot participate anymore. They will disappear from the political map. Why does he want to ban the opposition ahead of the elections, Javier?
First of all, it was not an announcement. It was a comment which was ill-advised. I don't think it was necessary to make a comment, especially after the Chavistas won these elections. He probably shouldn't have said that. However, the president does not have the power to ban political parties in Venezuela. The only people who can ban political parties is the National Electoral Commission, and there is also a law in Venezuela called the Law of Electoral Participation, Article 27, that says that if after a period of time a political party which has put his name in the voting registry, if they don't participate, they will have to be banned or they will have to apply again. This is an adaptation of a law which was approved in 2010, and it comes from 1964, long before Chavez came to power in 1999. So it was an ill-advised comment, but the president does not have any power to ban political parties. So this idea that he's going to ban them is absurd because he can't do that.
Okay, so Sonia, they boycotted Justice First, Popular Will, and Democratic Action. And I guess Maduro was rubbing it in after the mayoral races to say, if you don't run now, you can't run next year. But nobody's banned for the moment. So do they have nothing to worry about? Can they still compete fairly come the presidential election, Sonia?
Thank you. Actually, what I agree with the previous comment. But we have to keep in mind that Maduro has become a strong man in Venezuela. By strong man, I mean not because of his leadership, but because he is an authoritarian leader in Venezuela. So what it says with this comment is that there are no separation of powers, no rule of law in Venezuela, and undermining institutions. So in that regard, Maduro thinks that he can decide the destiny of Venezuela just by making some announcement without taking into account democratic means. So it's not a democracy anymore. It is an authoritarian regime.
Okay, and I see Javier shaking his head in disagreement, but I'm going to come to you in a moment. I want to get Marco's opinion first. Marco, the fact that Maduro's allies won more than 300 of 335 mayoral offices in this recent local election, should we be congratulating them?
Not at all. The reason why they have these results is because, of course, the majority of the opposition boycotted the election. Now, something to say about the banning. Yes, it's true. The president has no power to ban any political party from participating in a presidential election next year. However, they created during the summer something they call the Constituent Assembly. And this mandate of banning parties who boycott elections comes from that assembly. So it is actually to see if there will be banned or not. For the moment, we're not sure, but it sounds like it's going in that direction.
Okay, so Javier, it's interesting here because you say that only the parliament can do this, right? And while that may be true, others, such as Marco, would point to the fact that Maduro didn't like the parliament in the summer, so he created his own one, which suggests that he could control parliament and push through whatever he wants.
No, he didn't create anything. There was an election and the opposition decided to boycott it. They decided to boycott the Constituent Assembly election, even though they took part in the October elections for regional elections. They don't really, they want to pick and choose which rules and which elections they take part in and which ones they don't, which is an absolute nonsense. They decided not to participate. There was not a creation. It was an election, and it's true that only Chavistas took part because the opposition decided to boycott it, and again, there was a process in which this Constituent Assembly was elected. The opposition could have taken part, and it could have had representatives that could have stopped any kind of law against them. But they decided not to participate, so it's not a creation. Second, this assumption that because he said it, everything is going to be done according to what he said is absolute nonsense. We hear the same nonsense about it's a dictatorship. He was elected, the Constituent Assembly was elected, the regional elections, the governors were elected in October. I was an observer there, and I saw the process, and now there was an election. In which country where there is a dictatorship, there are so many elections where people come out and vote. So it's absolute nonsense. You have to show evidence that there is a dictatorship in order to make that accusation.
They're lining up, Javier, they're lining up to disagree with you here. I see shaking heads everywhere. Let me start with Marco. Marco, tell me why you disagree.
Well, first of all, what he's calling an election, that wasn't a real election. A third of that Constituent Assembly was basically, two-thirds, sorry, were basically appointed by the government. Only one-third was going to be part of this election. And of course, under those circumstances, no party in any country in the world would participate in such a thing. It is also interesting to mention that this Constituent Assembly has not received any recognition from any international organization or any international or from any country in the world, including the European Union, the United States, and most of Latin American countries.
Sonia, come in.
Yeah, actually, I will have to remind everybody that when the government called the Constituent Assembly, they skip an important step, which is to call for a referendum in order to submit this idea to the people. And this is what it is missing right now here in that. It's just only that the government or President Maduro just decided to call a national Constituent Assembly. So that's why it is illegal, and it was not recognized, not just only in the country by the opposition, but internationally too.
Javier, let me add to that. Javier, just a second, let me add to that. We have Maduro saying, quote, "The imperialists have tried to set fire to Venezuela to take our riches." He's blaming them for shortages of food, medicine, no toilet roll, crazy inflation. I mean, people selling their kids. He's saying the imperialists are doing this. Do you really believe that? Do you believe that it's imperial powers that are doing this to Venezuela, or that maybe he has wrecked the economy?
Before I answer your question, first of all, according to the Constitution, the President, the National Assembly of municipalities, or a group of people can call for a Constituent Assembly. There's no need for a referendum. There's no need, according to the Bolivarian Constitution, and I suggest that the lady reads the Constitution, because in this particular case, it was not a requirement to have a referendum to call for a Constituent Assembly election. First of all, in relation to what you say, there's an element of mismanagement of the economy on the side of the Venezuelan government, and I'm going to admit that I've been there twice this year, in May and now in October for the regional elections. There's been a slight improvement in the situation, but also there's a mismanagement in the economy, but at the same time, Venezuela is suffering the consequences of low oil prices. I saw the queues in pharmacies. I saw how difficult it is to get medicines. I'm not going to deny that. It would be absurd to deny that, but at the same time, there is an element of boycott from private companies which have been boycotting the distribution of basic produce in Venezuela. I saw that. Also, the violence in the streets provoked by the opposition, which I saw personally in May this year, created a great deal of uncertainty in terms of the way they want to distribute food. I'm not going to deny that there's been, for example, there is an element in the economy of Venezuela that is not working, which is this exchange control, which is damaging the economy and creating inflation. And many friends of the government are asking the government to stop this because it's creating a bad situation, it's making it worse. But there's elements of boycott from outside and sanctions which are affecting Venezuela as well, and the low prices of oil in the international market.
Interesting that you say sanctions. Sonia, let me ask you then, Trump's new sanctions on Venezuela, isn't it going to be counterproductive? Because all it does is it gets Maduro to turn to his people and say, you see, it's the imperialists, it's the Yankees that are sanctioning us. Doesn't it give him some sort of rhetorical, demagogic tools in order to have more populist support?
Well, first, let me be clear. The crisis, the economic, social, and political crisis in Venezuela was running long before the sanctions were applied by the international community. And by saying that, I mean that the crisis is long before, even when Chavez was in power. We have seen some signs of an incipient crisis in Venezuela. Okay, and the second part is that the situation right now with the sanctions, unfortunately, is going to have a deep impact on the population in Venezuela. And that's why we don't see people are taking the streets again, because they are in surviving mode in Venezuela.
Yeah, Marco,
they are not interested in fight political ideas or so.
Again, I mean, and it's horrendous to see people queue up for food, especially, you know, in the past few years, or a decade ago, Venezuela was a fantastic place economically, especially when you compared it to the neighborhood. Marco, how desperate is the situation now? I mean, is it as bad as it's ever been, and is it as bad as it's ever going to be, or do you foresee it getting worse?
Yeah, the situation right now is worse than it has ever been. We're now talking about a humanitarian crisis. We're talking about people eating once a day only. We're talking about a lack of medications. It's really, really dreadful. And something interesting to mention here is that the government is using hunger as a political tool. They have created something they call the Motherland ID, which in Spanish translates as Carnet de la Patria. And actually people are promised things, food and care and housing if they vote for the government. It's a dreadful situation what you're seeing now. It's kind of a perverse system.
Right. Javier, you say the government's not using hunger as a political tool.
No. First of all, I agree with him that actually the situation is pretty bad. He uses the word humanitarian crisis. I would like to refer that as serious and bad as it is, and I have seen it, it's pretty, very, very, very bad. It doesn't reach the level of humanitarian crisis according to the UN. There's a humanitarian crisis in South Sudan, in Nigeria. No, that's where you have that kind of
Javier, I mean,
the difference between one and the other. However, but I agree with you that the situation is pretty bad.
But thousands of refugees, Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago.
That's fine. I agree.
Cities like Boa Vista in Brazil, they're struggling to cope with
You have always decided.
You follow the traffic, right? It must be bad if people are going as refugees to neighboring countries that are poorer.
Can I finish? Am I debating against three people, including you?
Go ahead.
Can I have my say, please?
Go ahead. Javier, don't do that. Don't play that game. Come on. You say there's no humanitarian situation. I'm saying there's refugees. Finish your point.
I'm trying to answer the question, but you keep on interrupting me and taking the side of the other people. That's fine, fair enough, that's your prerogative. Listen, the situation is pretty bad. Now, the government has created grassroots communities which have decided to supply of produce in which Venezuela is still self-sufficient, to replace those which they can actually not get. Right, that's the first thing. Second, between May and October this year, when I was there twice, I saw a slight, not a big one, a slight improvement in the situation in Venezuela. Not good enough to satisfy the majority of people. I agree with that. There's got to be a certain level of, however, what the government tried to do is try to call the opposition to try to work together to find a solution for this situation, which is pretty bad and is getting it's not improving a great deal. So yes, I agree with you. I'm not going to deny that the situation is pretty bad, but at the same time, sanctions. It's true that this day before sanctions, but at the same time, sanctions have made the situation even worse than it was before. So we have a situation in which there's a combination of factors.
So let's take that. Let's pose that to Sonia. Sonia, the man's basically saying yes, it's bad, but you have to work with this government to make it better. Why don't you, Sonia, trust this government to work with them in order to reverse the humanitarian crisis?
Well, actually, we have to consider that the government is actually cornered because of the sanctions imposed especially by the US. So they don't have any way out. The only way out for them is to remain in power. So with this in mind, how can you trust a government that has nothing to lose, but they just have one goal, to remain in power? So what will be the purpose of a dialogue with the government? By saying that, I would like to also clarify that from the opposition, there are some mixed signals, because some members of the opposition were in favor of continue a dialogue with the government, and others not. Also the international community. So the Venezuelan people, or the people in Venezuela, is really very confused because they don't see a clear picture where the opposition wants to be.
Right.
So in that regard, I agree, it is very confusing right now, the situation.
Very finally, Marco, how do we get out of this?
Well, yeah, the opposition is definitely fragmented at the moment. However, the opposition was united in July when we had a referendum all over the world. And the way to get out of this is to get back to being united. I think the opposition has to unite, and they have to rally behind one candidate, ideally an outsider, somebody who will allow them to get some of the vote from the disenchanted Chavistas. And that's the way to go and participate in the election, in the presidential election next year.
Okay, so Javier, wouldn't that be a good thing if the opposition could get their act together, unite behind a single candidate, and we could have healthy democracy in the country?
Of course, of course, of course. Every democracy needs a strong opposition to make the government accountable for its actions. And I think there should be a strong opposition in Venezuela, and I hope that they agree to create an opposition, not only to be able to oppose the government, but also to offer an alternative to the economic situation which they haven't given offering yet. And by the way, I wanted to apologize for my reaction before, but you know, it's a very heated debate in relation to what's going on here. But yes, but we need a strong opposition in Venezuela. But it's very difficult to find how they are going to find a unified candidate for next year's election, because everything they're in total disarray. They have to offer an alternative to the economic situation in Venezuela. They haven't done that so far, and unless they do that, they are not going to have, people will not believe in them and they will not vote for them. So yes, there should be a strong opposition, because every democracy needs one, and unfortunately in Venezuela the opposition is not fulfilling that role that corresponds to a decent, ethical and valid, intelligent opposition. They have to agree, they have to get together, they have to create, you know, some kind of basic elements to be able to oppose the government. So far they haven't failed to do that, and I don't see how they can do that in the near future. Okay. I just don't see how. I hope they do, but I don't see how.
Okay, terrible times for the ordinary people of Venezuela. It is a divided society and the economy is in free fall. We hope they get to see better times. We hope to see you on the program as well in the future, Javier, Sonia and Marco. Unfortunately, I've got to move on, but it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, Geneva bans the burkini. Is this promoting hygiene, as the city claims, or Islamophobia? And Amnesty International accuses Shell of murder in Nigeria. Should the oil giant face criminal charges? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. If you want to go swimming in Geneva, you now need to be prepared to show some skin. The Swiss city has banned the burkini. Under new regulations, women must wear something which exposes their arms and legs. The city councillors say it's a matter of hygiene, but critics call the decision a clear attack on Muslims. So is this all about cleanliness, or is there something else going on here? Basil Rehan takes a look.
The burkini, a swimsuit designed to respect Islamic traditions of modest dress. However, contrary to its intended purpose, this one piece gets a lot of attention. City councillors in Geneva have redefined what constitutes appropriate swimwear at public pools, in doing so, effectively banning women from wearing burkinis and bathing topless. The city first introduced pool rules in September to stop young people from swimming in street clothes. The original rules limited pool users to wearing items specifically used for swimming. Some city councillors say the new changes target women who wear full-body swimwear. They're calling it an attack on Geneva's multiculturalism, but authorities say the move is only about hygiene and is not meant to target any specific group. Geneva is just the latest European city to take issue with the burkini. In 2016, France became the first country to ban the full-body swimsuit, but the law was struck down by the courts shortly after, ruled to be a violation of fundamental freedoms. There are also similar attempts to ban the burkini in Germany and Austria. Critics say the intense attention on swimwear is a sign of rising Islamophobia across Europe. The full-body burkini is an easy target for many right-wing groups across the continent, and many people are wondering whether Geneva's move to curb its use will trigger similar action elsewhere. Basil Rehan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Nusrat Qadir Chowdhury. She's the national spokeswoman for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Also in New York is Masih Alinejad. She's an Iranian journalist and the founder of My Stealthy Freedom, a movement fighting for the rights of women to not wear a hijab. And in London, we have Tom Wilson. He's a fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. I thank you all for joining us. Let me begin with Tom. What do you think, Tom, of this burkini ban? Is it a good idea?
Well, look, it's perfectly acceptable for public facilities such as swimming pools to put out regulations on what people can wear when they use those facilities. You can't get into a swimming pool fully clothed. And people who wish to wear something like the burkini in a swimming pool are perfectly welcome to set up their own facilities separately. But in Europe, there's a set of values to do with gender equality, and that's upheld on things like the bikini as well.
Okay, so let me ask you, Masih, is this going against the European set of gender values by wearing a burkini and wanting to go to a public swimming pool in a place like Switzerland?
Let me be honest with you. The thing is, in my country, Islamic Republic of Iran, wearing burkini is forbidden for women because it's too revealing. So I used to wear burkini in my country, and I got arrested just because it was too revealing for my government. But the thing is, I don't understand why always our government should tell women what to wear or not what to, or not wearing hijab. They have to leave it to women to make decisions for their own body. And I'm going to tell you, it's not easy for women who grew up in a Muslim family to leave their hijab behind if they don't believe in it. I myself grew up in a traditional family, traditional society, and I was forced to wear hijab from the age of 7. When I left Iran, I replaced my hijab with a black hat, my so-called hijab. So for me, it was not easy to leave my hijab behind, because when you grow up in such a society, hijab became part of your body. Right. And you think it's like your identity, and it's not easy to leave it. But it took me 3 years to leave my hijab. But if somebody forced me to leave it, it's not going to work, because we are, facing compulsion hijab in my country, and it's not working as well.
Okay, so let me ask you, Nusrat, when Swiss authorities in Geneva say, hey, this is about hygiene, and it's about basically a social contract where we have norms and decorum here, and burkini doesn't quite fit our norms and decorum. Do you believe them?
No, I don't. I think it is a target that's specifically geared towards Muslim women or any woman that chooses to dress modestly. You have members of many societies, inclusive of Sikh communities, Hindu communities, Jewish communities, and even Orthodox Christian communities that choose to cover and be modest. And why would you want to segregate them further for having done nothing wrong? If they wish to come and be a part of a swimming experience with their families, why would you separate them further? It does not allow for anyone to integrate when you're constantly creating laws that discriminate against specific women. And this isn't something that will in any way make any level of European values any better. European values allow for a liberal, secular society that allows people to make the freedom of choice and the freedom of their attire. So this is far from being a hygienic situation as much as it is a discriminatory one.
Tom, isn't that a fair point?
Well, look, on one hand, I think it is true that this is about more than just hygiene. It's about putting forward the kind of values that we have in the West, which includes gender equality. And I don't think that public spaces and public facilities should be endorsing a worldview that singles out and discriminates against women by saying they have to dress in a more modest way and cover up more than men do. There is a serious problem of integration. I think we should start by talking about gender equality. If you wish to dress in a way that doesn't endorse gender equality in your own facilities, that's fine. But European values shouldn't be expected to change for conservative religious communities.
But it's interesting, Tom, because I'm looking at the details here. It says a swimsuit with a skirt is forbidden. City councillors reportedly voted in favor of rules requiring women to wear a 1- or 2-piece swimming costume that exposes their arms and does not come below the knee. What's interesting is when I read that, it sounded like their own rules of hijab. It sounded like a kind of secular puritanism, because there were very specific codes here embedded into it. What happened to Switzerland being very chilled out about wearing whatever you wanted to when you went to the swimming pool?
But it's not about secular puritanism. What it is about is a problem that we have in Europe where, on the whole, European values always favours individual liberty wherever it can. However, at the moment, Europe is encountering the growth the emergence of an ultra-conservative and illiberal worldview that doesn't accept gender equality, as embodied by expecting women in this ideology to wear something like the bikini. And the Muslim feminist Yasmin Alabai-Brown has written very well on this and about what it represents, the idea that the female form is problematic and it needs to be covered up in some way. We don't endorse that, and I don't think our public spaces and public facilities should validate that worldview.
Masih, is this a violation of human rights? You know, frankly speaking, are your human rights being violated if you can't wear a burkini?
Can I just add something?
Okay, go ahead.
Can I just add something? I am really, really surprised that right now in Islamic Republic of Iran, all the female politicians, whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim, all the Western politicians and Western tourists are forced to wear hijab. And it's not a topic in the West, because the Islamic Republic of Iran trying to say that wearing hijab is just out of the respect and you have to respect our culture. And in Europe now they say that, you know, burkini is against the Western culture. I am wondering that this is 21st century. Why we're going to come up with the result that don't write your ideology on the body of women. And I'm wondering why those women who are against burkini ban, they are silent when it comes to compulsory hijab. Because right now, the foreign minister of Iran invited the female politician from the UK, and our foreign minister was telling the female politician, the British diplomat, cover your hair.
Okay, so
and this is humiliation as well.
Okay, that's interesting. Let me take the analogy.
This is a violence against women's rights as well.
So let me ask you very briefly, before I move on, is it a violation of human rights when you can't wear the burkini?
I am saying that forcing a woman to remove their hijab or to wear the hijab, it is a violation. But keeping silent about compulsory hijab and talking about burkini ban is just a hypocrite.
Okay, you feel there's a double standard there. Fair enough. Tom, let me ask you what you think.
It's a double standard, yes.
Okay, let me ask you what you think of that analogy. The fact that you have an Iranian woman here saying, hey, guess what? It reminds me of back home. When you're telling women to take off their hijab or their burkini, it reminds me of back home when women, local or foreign, are forced to wear the hijab. She creates that analogy. Do you find it disingenuous, or do you see some sense in that?
Well, we're not telling people that they can't go swimming in a burkini. What we're saying is, in public facilities, they uphold certain norms and values. You're perfectly welcome to wear your bikini if you want, if you have a private swimming pool or you have some other place where, you know, you could have gender segregation if that's what some Muslim communities want in their own swimming pools. But the European values shouldn't have to change to accommodate conservative minorities. That's the main thrust of the feeling. And it's not uncommon for democracies and liberal societies to ban certain practices and certain clothing if it so offends the liberal sensibilities. For instance, here in Britain, paramilitary uniforms and political uniforms are banned. In other countries, the swastika is banned. There are certain things that offend liberal values, and if they go so far, then you can legislate against them.
Okay, so that's interesting. So Nusrat, as a hijab-wearing woman, how do you feel about the fact that, and I'm glad that Tom mentioned paramilitary uniforms and so on. So ultimately, he's talking about outfits that make people feel uncomfortable. So how do you feel as a Muslim woman who wears a hijab that Tom might be suggesting, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he can disagree with me or tell me I'm wrong if he feels that is the case, but he feels that according to some Europeans, when they see you in your hijab or a burkini, it offends their sensibilities, and they might extrapolate out of that feelings of fear and connect it to issues of terrorism and so on. And that's why they feel uncomfortable in the public space, and that's why they don't want to see you with your hijab or your burkini. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's an area which requires dialogue, and this is a great deal of misinformation to assume that anybody who is choosing to observe their religious practice by choice, not by force, especially in a Western society, I am choosing to wear this on my own. It is not something that someone has forced upon me. And if how I am dressed is offensive to somebody, we can begin to say this about many things. Many people may wear things that you find contrary to your own belief systems. So to just poke at one group of people and to suggest that is a clear, direct incitement against those particular people that has become part and parcel of our current climate and conversation against Muslims. And this is something that we do need to keep in mind. And to answer to Masoom's questions, in regards to any government forcing a woman to wear hijab, that is equally as wrong. There are people that have stated outwardly and spoken against this. For instance, the spiritual leader of the Muslim community, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmed, has also told people over and over that you cannot force anyone to fall to any patterns of any faith that goes against, contrary to their own desires and choices. It must be something that people make on their own. And we cannot do this. You win hearts, not with force, but with thought and with consideration, and allowing people the freedom of choice to select what faith they wish to follow. You cannot make it compulsory, right, as she has suggested is being done in Iran.
Okay, so Masih, would you agree with that? Would you find Nusrat's argument acceptable, that she's saying, yes, she's against the burkini ban, she wears the hijab herself, but she's not for enforcement of hijab, whether in the West or Iran or anywhere else? Do you agree with her, and do you find that a reasonable, happy medium?
You know, what I'm saying, it's toward the female politician and Muslim community when they keep silent about compulsory hijab, which is, you know, millions of girls are forced to wear it. My question is just, you know, really simple. How many countries in the world forcing women to take off their hijab? And they won't be allowed to get an education or live in the Western country if they don't, you know, accept the cultural, the Western culture. How many countries forcing women to take off their hijab? And compare it to other side, how many countries, you know, in the world that forcing women to wear hijab? Social pressure, family pressure, or the compulsory hijab laws? And then think about it. How many times you condemned compulsory hijab, and how many times you condemned burkini ban?
Certainly.
That is what I'm saying, that female politicians, when they go to...
Okay, got it. Point well made. Tom, let me ask you just very finally, as we're in the middle of these, what are seemingly culture wars, France seems to have set the tone for it last year with their burkini ban. What does it tell us about where the continent is going now, as we're seeing these sorts of issues come more and more to the forefront? We're seeing Switzerland now. Are we going to see more of this going forward?
Well, I think quite possibly, because of course Angela Merkel in Germany, who's generally been seen as a pillar of European liberalism, she has come out in favour of a burqa ban in public buildings at least. We know in Britain the public favours a ban of the full face veil. And I think that it is the case that Europe is trying to negotiate between its values of generally supporting individual liberty to do what people like, but at the same time not wanting to endorse and validate a worldview that discriminates by saying women must cover up in a way it doesn't expect men to also cover up.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure listening to all of you. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Masih, Ali Najad, Nusrat Qadir Chowdhury, and Tom Wilson. Thanks again. When it comes to the failings of an oil company, you probably think of an environmental devastation. But what if it also has led to the killing of innocent people? The oil company Shell is accused of just that. According to Amnesty International, the firm's executives encouraged a brutal crackdown to silence protesters in the Nigerian region of Ogoniland. During the 1990s, protesters campaigned to protect their homeland. But according to leaked Shell documents, the company was pushing the military to end the demonstrations. Several activists were allegedly raped and tortured and executed, including author Ken Saro-Wiwa. Well, the Newsmakers invited Shell onto the program. They declined, but sent us this statement. We have always denied in the strongest possible terms the allegations made in this tragic case. The executions of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his fellow Ogonis in 1995 were tragic events that were carried out by the military government in power at the time. Now, you can read the full statement on our Facebook page. Well, joining me now from London is Mark Dummett. He's a researcher at Amnesty International. He's also the co-author of the report accusing Shell of human rights abuses in Nigeria. Mark, good to have you on the program. That's what they say, and it's a great tragedy that they didn't want to come onto the show to debate. But they've put out their statement. You heard what they had to say. Does any of that sound reasonable to you?
Well, Shell never really wants to debate these issues. They never really want to go into the details. The company's very comfortable in issuing fairly blanket denials, but not really looking exactly what happened at the time and responding in detail to our allegations and the allegations of others. You know, my colleagues and I have been looking at Shell's role in this brutal crackdown by the Nigerian military in Ogoniland in the 1990s for much of the past year. And we think the evidence is fairly strong that Shell executives, as you said, encouraged this campaign. And that's why we are calling for criminal investigations here in the UK and also in the Netherlands, which is where Shell is headquartered, because we think that, you know, after so long, the truth should come out and people should be held accountable.
What if they were unaware of the scale of the crackdown? What if, yes, they did encourage the military and said, hey, we need to look after our own interests, we're coming under attack, these protesters are disrupting business and they're making life difficult for us, please sort it out. But they were unaware of the methodology and the extent of the brutality. Is that plausible?
It's totally implausible. The scale of the military crackdown was well known and widely reported on by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, some of the international organizations. The media internationally reported very widely on this brutal crackdown, which lasted several years in Ogoniland. There's absolutely no way that Shell, one of the world's largest and most powerful organizations, didn't know what was going on. And in fact, the documents that we have seen, which were released as part of legal proceedings in the US, show that executives in Nigeria knew perfectly well what was happening and were in fact informing their superiors here in London and in The Hague. So there's absolutely no doubt that Shell knew that the Nigerian military was responsible for extremely grave human rights violations in Ogoniland in response to these protests.
Would it be difficult to actually open this up again, because not only would you be putting Shell on trial, but also the Nigerian military, because ultimately they would have done the killing, not Shell?
Right, good question. I mean, you know, obviously the people who were directly responsible for these human rights violations were the Nigerian military. No one's accusing Shell staff or executives of being involved in actually what was happening on the ground. You know, obviously, the perfect scenario would be for justice to be done within Nigeria. But, you know, in the past 23 years, that just hasn't happened. And so that's why, you know, and it's not just in this case, but in other cases involving Shell around pollution, that's why Nigerians have been forced to come to the UK and the Netherlands to try and seek justice in the courts here, because the avenues for justice in Nigeria, unfortunately and sadly, are closed.
Right. Widows of the executed filed a writ against Shell in the Netherlands. Are you going to be piggybacking on that? Are you going to be, you know, sort of adding to that? Tell me what's happening with that particular case, and if they have any chance of that going to trial.
Right, so that's a civil claim. There are 4 women whose husbands were executed following an unfair trial. They were involved in the protests against Shell. They're suing Shell in the Netherlands. As you say, they filed a writ in June. We support that case, and it's really prompted by that we decided to re-examine all of the evidence. And actually, you know, we're often asked, well, why now? Why are you looking at this now after so much time? Well, you know, Amnesty has been calling for justice for the victims of this crackdown in Ogoniland since the 1990s, but we were prompted to re-examine the evidence by this case that was launched in June. Those women are calling for compensation, but also a public apology from Shell, which is hugely important to them, to these women. We think that the evidence is stronger than just their case, however, which is why we're calling for this criminal investigation as well as this civil case.
Did you hear what Andrew Brown had to say to Stephen Sackur recently?
Yes, I did. This was at the Cambridge University,
right,
in which Andrew Brown, who's a senior executive of Shell, said that he was very proud of working for Shell and was responsible for operations in Nigeria.
Yeah. So he goes, executive committee, and Stephen Sackur asks him if he was proud of what Shell had done or his work with Shell in Nigeria, and he said, quote, I'm fundamentally proud of what happened in Nigeria. So let's just put this into context, right? We reached out to them. We tried very hard to get them on the program, either for a debate with you or someone else, or as a one-on-one, even if they didn't want to debate. They refused. They sent us a statement, and it's worded very similarly to other statements they sent to other media outlets. And then you have Andrew Brown saying, hey, we're proud of what we've done in Nigeria. So when you hear all of that and you put all of that together, what does that tell you about what Shell thinks of all of these claims and whether they take it seriously?
What I generally feel about Shell's response, as I said, is two things really. Firstly, they never really want to discuss the details. They're afraid of being pinned down by the details, I feel personally. In the past, I've challenged them over their record, and my colleagues at Amnesty have challenged them over their record on the environment, all these oil spills which take place in Nigeria. And again, they issue fairly generic replies saying that denying the allegations that they're negligent. But when we actually ask them about specific spills and specific incidents and locations, they shy away from the details. So that's one way in which I recognise one pattern in the standard Shell response. The other thing is they don't like talking about the past. They always want to talk about the future. And no doubt Shell individuals, are proud of where they think the company is going, but we feel that they can't ignore the past. They can't ignore what happened in Nigeria in the 1990s. And I also think, we also think that the responsible governments, so the government of the UK, of the Netherlands, of Nigeria, shouldn't ignore what happened in the past in Ogoniland. And when you talk to Ogonis, the wounds are still very, very raw. It's like it happened yesterday. These are issues that need to be resolved, and justice needs to be done.
And it's, I guess, worth reminding our viewers that the protests began as a result of environmental degradation and spills, right? That's the very reason they rose up and decided to protest against Shell and wanted them kicked out. So that happened at the beginning, and then down the line, people end up dead. So it's kind of an entire sort of beginning, middle, and end here, isn't it?
Right, exactly, and the pollution has still never been cleaned up. I mean, Shell has never returned to Ogoniland. Following the protest, the communities there have never allowed them to return. But, the problems, as you said, that forced them to rise up, the pollution, but also the unfair distribution of the wealth that comes from the oil, those issues have still never been resolved. And I don't know if you saw, there was a study which was reported quite widely a few weeks ago, talking about the high mortality rate in the Niger Delta of newborn babies, who are born close to spill sites. So, the environmental record and the appalling levels of pollution have a direct and appallingly negative impact on the people living there. And unfortunately, these haven't been resolved. Now, Ken Saro-Wiwa, the leader of these protests, provided an opportunity for Nigeria and Shell and the other oil companies to deal with these issues peacefully. But instead, the Nigerian military decided to crack down, and they've still never addressed those underlying root causes.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary report. Mark, I congratulate you on some of the findings. It's extraordinary reading. Mark Drummett joining us from Amnesty International. I thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Russia declares victory in Syria. We'll debate what Moscow's withdrawal means for the conflict. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.